Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome, everyone. Fantastic to be gathered sort of out here at Mark and Denise's with this little fish pond behind us. There's koi fish in there that I bred a number of years ago and gave them to Mark. Yep. And they're growing, Mark, so fantastic. Welcome to all those online. Sorry about last week. This week we promised that the live stream will work perfectly and forever on afterwards. It will never fall, will it, hey?
That's been wonderful.
Yes. Now, just to let you know, as a church, we are right in the middle now of negotiating for a lease on a building in Main Street, Bairnsdale. And it's quite a good-sized building, and it's going to need some work on it. It's a bit sad and miserable looking, but we're going to, if we get it, we're going to run with it and put some love into the place, and we'll have a home. And so just want you to pray into that. It's not a done deal, but we've begun a process. And so just giving you up to date on that. Next week, where are we, Lauren? Quick, where are we? Lucknow Hall.
I can't think 5 minutes from now, sorry.
Sorry, Lauren, will you just please wake up? Right. Lucknow Hall for the next 2 weeks after this. And I think we should put on a bit of lunch barbecue next Sunday at Lucknow Hall. And it'll be just great to gather in a venue indoors. And we'll see where we go after that. But the next 2 weeks that's where we're going to be. So over to you.
Sounds good.
Oh, before we go.
Oh, before?
Did you remember something that I forgot?
Probably not.
No, well, I've remembered
Birthdays?
what I had forgot. Well, birthdays, yep.
Yeah, okay. What else?
But also, I want to pray for our friend Bonnie. Bonnie's in a real struggle, a fight for her life now with cancer, and I just want to stop right now and I just want to pray for Bonnie. Lord, I thank you that she's your daughter and you love her. And just on the basis of that, I speak your strength, your peace into her. Give her the capacity to breathe. I pray, Father, that you'd heal her. I pray, Lord, that you would bring comfort to her brother and his family in New Zealand, to her brother in New South Wales, Lord, to his family, that there would be a family united around your strength, and that you would bring comfort, you would bring peace, and you'd bring healing to Bonnie in every area of your life, Father. Thank you, Lord. And also, today we're going to be praying for kids as well. At the end of this, I've asked Nick especially to pray for kids, so we're going to have a time praying for kids as well. Yes. And
You probably can't read that.
Milan had a birthday.
oh, happy birthday. Yes, I rang Milan. Yes.
Happy birthday, Milan.
Right. Okay, I'm going to get out of here. Okay,
Alright.
swap your places.
Watch the leads. Wow. We're going to sing Evidence. So stand or sit or whatever you want to do. Go, Jeff. All throughout my history, faithfulness has walked beside me. The winter storms made way for spring. In every season, from where I'm standing, I see the evidence of your goodness all over my life, all over my life. I see your promises in fulfillment all over my life, all over my life. should I feel the evidence is here? Why should I fear? Oh, the evidence is here. Lord, the evidence is here. We have no reason to fear, regardless of any storm we're going through, whatever stage of life. Help us trust you. I love you, Lord. Oh, your mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up till I lay my head, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. Every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. I love your voice. You have led me through the fire, the darkest night. You were close like no other. I've known you as a father, known you as a friend, and I have lived in the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. And again, your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, I surrender now. I give you everything. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I've carried a burden for too long on my own. I wasn't created to bear it alone. I hear your invitation to let it all go. I see it now, laying it down. I know that I need you. I run to the Father, fall into grace. Done with the hiding, the reason away. Heart needs a surgeon, soul needs a friend. So I run to the Father again and again and again. Lord, if there's any obstacles in the way from us running to you, remove them.
Thank you. Do you know, right now we've got people gathered in the Old Station Cafe. We've got people watching online. I love the fact that there's a family in New Zealand that are connected to someone in Lakes Entrance, and they're watching. And they're even been showing some of our Redgum stuff in their home group in New Zealand. That's what I've been told, so pretty amazing. Do you know, I just want to thank everyone for the giving with Redgum, because without the giving, we couldn't even look at renting a facility in the main street of Bairnsdale. And what intrigues me about this property is that 18 years ago, I stood in the same building and actually began a proposal to lease it as a youth centre and as a youth cafe called the Goanna Bar. We're going to set that up with there. And here we are 18 years later looking at the same venue, possibly for Redgum, but also my whole life has been youth ministry. I can't lead a church that doesn't have a strong influence of youth in our community. And this venue would actually give us that. We may not get this venue, but we certainly are pushing towards that. So thank you for your giving, because without that, we couldn't even be at this position now. God's will and God's ways are very, very different. God never, ever wanted Israel to have a king. It was not his will. But every community needs leadership. Every nation needs a leader. And leadership is always the answer, and sadly, leadership is always the problem. And God wanted to lead his nation Israel through a spiritual oversight of judges and prophets. He raised up a woman, Deborah, who was both prophet and judge. And God put her in the position of a leader, a female in the leadership position of a nation that was very male-dominated in its culture. And when kings were established in the life of Israel, that was the last time there was a female leader in that nation. But kings were never God's will. God never wanted a centralised government to be how his nation would be led. And if you don't like paying taxes, don't blame God. God warned Israel what would happen if they had a king. But they said, we want to be like every other nation. We want a king that will fight our battles for us. That was their words. And God's going, no, you don't. No, you do not want a king. I'm telling you, you do not want a king. In fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, God says, there will come a day, if you have a king, that you'll cry out to me for relief from the government that you have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you in that day. And the reason God would not answer their cry was because he couldn't. See, God's ways are to give us our own will. We can make our own choices. I can walk up to my brother Jeff and I can punch him in the nose. I've got that choice. I could do that. But the consequences I can't choose. Now, he may not retaliate. Jeff's a nice person. Last time I punched him, he never retaliated. But if I did it this time, now that we're adults, the wrath of his wife, Kath, and my wife, Coral, would ruin my life. The consequences I couldn't choose, but I can choose to do that. And even though God told them that asking for a king was evil in his eyes, his way was to actually choose their first king for them. What? Really? God's saying this is an evil thing you're wanting, but I'll choose a king for you. And then he chose the next one and the next one. And putting a man into a position of that sort of power was the opposite of God's will, and yet he did it. In 1788, 700 convicts arrived on the shores of Botany Bay. And what came with those convicts was the men in charge of those convicts. And there was the establishment in 1788 here on Australian soil of a new penal colony. And if a convict was accused of misconduct, which simply meant that those in authority over them deemed them to be rude, insolent, they didn't like them for whatever reason, they could then have that person flogged with a whip. They'd be stretched out on a triangular wooden thing, tied to it or tied to a tree, and these whips were designed to inflict incredible harm and damage and pain. In fact, many people died from being flogged, and they were unable to work as a convict after they'd been flogged. In fact, some people got flogged a second time because they couldn't work. In 1793, the first free settlers arrived in Australia. 2 men, single, and 2 families. Now, until 1824, the military governors of Australia had absolute power. They're isolated from England. They could do whatever they wanted to the convict settlement. But gradually, free settlers started arriving. And gradually, this new colony emerged. And in this new colony were amazing freedoms. Freedoms that people had never known before in England and other countries where they'd come from. They found it here in Australia. Then in January 1901, by an act of the British Parliament, Australia became the Commonwealth of Australia. And in every subsequent government, both federally and state since then, every time governments have passed laws and bylaws and rules, someone has lost a freedom. Someone has lost a right. If you enjoy fishing, just simply to chuck a line in the water, you have to have a fishing licence. Why? Well, I guess they're trying to raise money to pay for fishing licence inspectors that can go around and check if fishermen have licences. That's the only thing I can think of. Like, there's an old saying that a dog is man's best friend. Well, only if it's desexed. Because if it's not desexed, that dog will cost you $200 a year in a fee of having an unsexed dog, even if you never breed from it. And I say a fee, but it's really a fine for having a different worldview than those in power over us when it comes to dogs. We don't have a choice. We're told you're a very bad, irresponsible person if you have a dog and it's not desexed. So we'll fine you $200 a year until that dog's 10 years of age. Now, notice I haven't mentioned anything about governments to do with COVID. I am just simply talking about what governments do, what God warned Israel against, that you're going to lose freedoms and rights from a government. That's what governments do. So how do we as Christians, as God's kids, respond when we see our freedoms and our rights disappearing? And if you don't understand the difference between God's will and God's ways, you're going to struggle getting that question right. Last week, it was Coral's and my wedding anniversary. So we went to Mr. D's. Our daughter Bronnie shouted us to go there, and we went to Mr. D's for a meal on Friday night. Now, this nice young guy who works there met us at the door and wouldn't allow us in till we'd done the QR code and proved to him of our vaccination status. And I said to him, I understand why you're doing this, but I resent the fact that it's being done, that I'm having to do this to prove to be able to get into this building that I've been into many times before, or 3 or 4 times anyway. But anyway, back in the garden, when God created Adam and Eve, he said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it." And the word subdue means to bring order out of chaos. And then he said this, "Rule over the fish of the sea," nothing about fishing licenses, "and the birds of the air, and every living creature on the ground, including dogs." We're meant to have dogs, Coral. You understand, dogs are part of our human wiring. It's how God made us, dogs, right? Now, God gave us rulership over everything except ourselves, except each other, sorry. God called us to rule over everything he made, but not over each other, because that is not his will. And in Jesus, when he's dealing with this, a power struggle within his leadership team, he actually calls them together. He says, "Boys, come here. We're going to have a little talk. This is the talk we're having. You know that the rulers of this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those that they're in charge of." And then he says, don't do that. That's not my way. Don't do that. He says, "But among you, it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be a servant." Now, Jesus is not saying that churches shouldn't have leadership. He's saying leaders are to lay down their life for those that they are serving. It's putting the needs of others ahead of your own agenda, of your own ego, of your own wants. I once jokingly said to my girls, "I've never done a thing in life that I didn't want to do." And they laughed because they sort of knew it was partly true. But every week, I willingly do things that others would not do. I choose to lay down my life, to serve, to give my energy and time for others, which means that I don't own what others own in the choices they make in life. But see, that's what God has called me to do, and it's an adventure. Now, can I let people down? Absolutely. I'm a flawed human being that has limitations. It's not my heart, but sure, I will do that at some point. Last week, I read a verse out of Isaiah 49, and it says this, "He who has compassion on them will guide them and lead them beside springs of water." That's God's heart. That's God's will. But God's ways are to allow leaders, even in churches, to lead in ways that are harmful and destructive. And most of Israel's kings were evil. There weren't many good kings. And even those that were good were pretty messed up in some areas of their life. Like David, he gets a tick for being one of the best, and he doesn't have a really good history of everything he did. Now, Jesus' concept of this servant leader is where we actually get the title or the description public servant, which is applied to people that we vote into power in our nation. And God's will is that federally and state by state, Australia would be led by leaders that follow Jesus and have a biblical worldview. That is God's will. But what do we do when leaders that are in power, who are not really true public servants, they lead out of ego? They do things that divide communities, that divide families, that even divide churches, and they seek more and more power and control. And if they're even anti-God, what do we do? What is God's way for us to respond? Paul, in an email to Timothy, he begins in chapter 2 of 1 Timothy with these words, I urge you. It's like, it's not just a good idea he's having. It's not just a nice thought. He's going, I urge you. There's some passion in this. He's got this powerful concept that he wants to get through to us, and he begins with, I urge you. And then he says this, first of all, I want you to pray for all people. Ask God to help them, to intercede on their behalf, to give thanks for them. That's the big picture. And then Paul almost dramatically narrows it down, and he shifts the focus from the big picture of praying for everyone. And it sort of almost takes your breath away if you read this for the first time, because he says, take this same sort of prayer, and he gets very specific. He says, pray this way for kings and all who are in authority. And then he gives us the motivation, the reason why we should do that. It's not for their sake, it's for our sake. And he says, so that we can live peacefully and quiet lives marked by godliness and dignity. There's no dignity in being forced to be vaccinated to keep your job. There's no dignity in that. There's no dignity in being excluded from a shop in your local town on a vaccination status. There's no dignity in that. And then Paul continues, this is good and pleasing God our Saviour, who wants everyone to be saved and understand the truth. He's showing us God's heart, his will, that everyone be saved. Peter expresses it this way, God's will for humanity, says, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. And repentance means to see differently, to be willing to see things differently. God's will is that none should perish. God's ways are to allow us to have a free choice, which means many will perish. God's ways are to allow evil leaders to have power over us. Can't we protest? Can't we sign petitions? Of course. If we don't push back against wrong things, governments get no feedback and they will do whatever they want to do. So, yes, within our power, we should do what we can do. We've signed petitions. We have the power to vote. But God is telling us his way, the place that you begin, the first place, is actually prayer, which doesn't come naturally if you want to fight. Praying doesn't come when you just want to get up and... But God's ways are to actually begin with prayer. Now, if that's all God's ways required, to pray for leaders of our community, of our nation occasionally, I could do that occasionally. I could do that. And then I could spend the rest of my time bagging them out and my energy telling you what's wrong to anyone that would listen to me. And I could push back as hard as I could, and I could rebel as much as I was able to. But when Jesus asked to join a protest, when Jesus was asked to join a protest against this barbaric Roman occupying government that was in their nation, when he was asked to join the protest by not paying taxes, his response was, well, give Caesar what he wants and give God what he wants. Well, what does God want? Our obedience. But more than that, he wants us to understand, to know his ways. For our sake, for our benefit, for the benefit of our community. And Paul gives us some very clear teaching on God's ways when it comes to responding to those in power over us. And it's found in Romans chapter 13. And I personally find this a hard concept to accept. I naturally want to rebel against authority. I just do. I'm wired that way. And Paul begins everyone. And I'm thinking there's got to be a exemption to that word everyone. It's got to, surely I'm not included in everyone, but I've looked at it. And that word everyone, it means everyone. And he says, everyone must submit himself to governing authorities, for there's no authority except that which God has established. And that just hurts when you hear that. And then Paul repeats himself so we can't misunderstand what he's saying. He says, the authorities that exist have been established by God. Surely God's will couldn't be that Daniel Andrews leads Victoria. That can't be God's will. Well, it's not. God would love to have a Christian premier leading Victoria. That's God's will. God's will is none that perish. He would want every politician to have a Christian worldview. But do you know what? Having a Christian Prime Minister doesn't change anyone in Bairnsdale to becoming a Christian. It's what we do, how we respond to the world around us. That's what people are seeing. They're not seeing what a Prime Minister does. And so God's ways include Daniel Andrews. Growing up, there are lots of talk about when Jesus would return. It was a really common thing for Christians when I was a teenager to be very focused on when Jesus would return because, see, in 1948, Israel had become a nation. They had got their own land back. That was a really big deal back in 1948 because no nation in the history of the world has been without their own land, their own homeland for 2,000 years and come back and re-establish themselves on their own homeland. It's never happened. But see, it was part of the prophetic voice that God has put all through his word. This would happen before Jesus returned. So the Christians back then became very focused on when Jesus would come back. But then over the years since, that interest has dropped off a bit until COVID. Until this thing called COVID suddenly changed everything in our world. Even the language of a vaccinated economy. Just those words has sent Christians scrambling to their Bibles and looking at even the mark of the beast and end-time prophecies. Well, being forced to be vaccinated is not the mark of the beast. That it's clearly not that, but it gives us for the first time in our lives, for me personally, being able to see how what I could never understand as a teenager could become reality. How God's prophecy, and when he spoke about these end times, when Jesus gives us in Matthew 24 a list of all the things to watch for, he said, I'm telling you this, but don't be fearful. Don't be worried. This is going to come. These are the things that are going to lead up to it, but this is not to be fearful about it. And it's right to push back against what's wrong. We must do what we can. And if we know it's not God's will, we should express a pushback to that. But like Israel, Victoria has the government that it chose and probably will re-elect. And as I said, I struggle with Paul's very clear teaching on God's ways of responding to those in authority over us. But there's a purpose behind it. And after Paul says all of that stuff, he says, after he says that there's no authority except that which God has established, he says this, consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do that will bring judgment upon themselves. It doesn't depend on whether we voted for them, whether we agree with their political agenda or their worldview, or whether even taking our nation or our state. This is God's way. Even if they do evil, Paul says in verse 4, he is God's servant to do you good. How? How does that work? Well, in Jeremiah, God himself describes Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, as his servant. And then 4 verses later, God says, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation and the land of the Babylonians for their guilt, and I will wipe them out and their land will be desolate. And 4 verses earlier, God calls this evil man his servant. And Paul finishes on calling us again to submit in these verses in Romans 13, to submit to the governing authorities, and 3 times he calls them God's servant. And he finishes up by saying, let's get really practical. If you've withheld as a protest your taxes, pay your taxes to Rome. And he says, if you've held respect back, give respect that you've held back. Give it to the authorities. Give them even honour. We do not have a culture in Australia of honouring and respecting leaders, especially politicians, right? But this is counter. This is God's ways. It's not how I would respond. It's maybe not how you would respond, but it's God's ways. But here's the balance in all this, right? We're called to submit, but we're not called to bow. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they understood the difference. They served Nebuchadnezzar. They took on Babylonian names. They actually worked for strengthening the Babylonian Empire. They were over the whole province of Babylon as leaders. They could have gone back to Jerusalem, but they chose to live in Babylon. But when it came to worshipping Nebuchadnezzar, they said, we're not doing that. We're not going to bow. We will submit. We'll serve you, but we will not bow. And when Jesus was explaining the difference between Caesar, what he demanded, and what God wanted, he grabbed a coin and he said, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, give to God what's God's. What's God's? Our obedience, our worship. We don't give that to anyone else. And when Jesus went to the cross, he submitted himself to evil men and evil authorities, but he made it clear in John 10 that they were not taking his life. He was laying his life down. And when you submit to authorities above you, it sets you free from being a victim, because you're choosing higher ground. You're choosing God's ways above your own ways, your own responses. And when we seek to follow God and his ways, we find rest. It's what God promised Moses. And I explained the word last week. That word rest means to be free from sorrow. It's resting from sorrow. There's no confusion. There's no regrets. There's no negative emotions. There's a place of rest that God offers when we do his ways, which is often different to his will. I'm just going to pray. Lord, help us to understand. Teach us your ways, that we could know rest in the middle of really difficult times in our nation. That we would see that beyond all the stuff that's going on, your ways are being done, and that you are going to ultimately have a victory that is worldwide, and that we all get to experience Jesus coming back for a bride that's free of wrinkles and spots and blemishes and blame. And I thank you that if we will be open and receptive to understanding your ways, you will bring a settledness within us, and that the fight that we think is our battle to take on, we actually can give it to you, and we can see what you do despite all the things that are going wrong around us. Thank you for that, Lord. We'll catch you next week, and we're going to pray for some kids, and we're going to turn the cameras off, and Nick's got a word for someone as well. So Nick, do you want to come and share that? Yep. Actually, just before that,